Hello and welcome back to the Plugged In Podcast, a weekly news show all about the future of transportation. I'm Patrick George, editor-in-chief of InsideEVs.
And I'm Tim Levin, senior reporter at InsideEVs. We're off for the July 4th holiday this week, so instead of talking about the news, we have a really exciting interview for you all.
It's our nation's birthday, so we're taking stock of the state of electrification in America. So what follows is a discussion with Ben Prochazka, who's the executive director of the Electrification Coalition, a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that's focused on decarbonizing transportation.
Yeah, this was a really fun conversation, and I'm excited for you all to hear it. We'll be back next week with our regularly scheduled programming.
Well, this has been a really challenging year on the electrification front. We're seeing all sorts of EV and climate and green tech and even hybrid initiatives getting rolled back by the Trump administration, and automakers are kind of following suit right now. It's been a tough year, but we want to talk about like where things are at as we approach our nation's birthday, and also what people who are advocates for green energy and electrification and fighting climate change can do to hit back a little bit. So we're joined today by Ben Prochazka, who is the executive director of the nonprofit Electrification Coalition. Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Patrick and Tim. It's a pleasure to be here, and I always enjoy reading your stuff and listening to your podcast, so pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us, man. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what Electrification Coalition does? Like we talked to you quite a bit on the website, and so just give our listeners a rundown of your organization and what you guys do.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So the Electrification Coalition was started in 2008. We have a sister organization called SAFE, sort of different things that we do. But at this point, the EC started out with a bit of a different mission than a lot of the groups that work on electrification. We are focused on the economic and national security impacts that our transportation sector's oil dependency faces. So oil has a monopoly on transportation in the U.S. That oil as a sort of commodity it's an international commodity. The market is manipulated by bad actors that don't share our democratic values. And so those peaks and valleys are bad too, actually put us at great economic and national security. You could tie all kinds of challenges in the U.S. economy to when oil markets are fluctuating heavily. But also it's a monofuel, right? It's like you have one choice when you buy an internal combustion engine vehicle. And so an EV, you plug into the grid, you can power an EV through any number of resources. Some are going to want clean and green, but some maybe don't care, and it doesn't matter. You don't have to care how the electrons are produced. It just means you can be diverse in price. Price of the electricity grid is much more stable. But before I go way too off into that, we work at the local, state, and federal level. We work on policy. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of policy needs to accelerate electrification. And then we also work on the actions. That means actually direct implementation programs where we're doing real world programs on the ground. So we created one of the nation's first rental car programs in Orlando. We helped run the Smart City Challenge on behalf of a philanthropic partner, but in partnership with the U.S. Department of Transportation. And that was a 78-city competition that happened a number of years ago. And then we do a bunch of other things. But, we're kind of I think a good way to sum it all up is we are working from the minerals to market to accelerate the adoption of plug-in electric vehicles so that we can fix economic and national security.
Yeah, very cool. So obviously policy and federal policy has kind of been top of mind for all of us this year, for everybody in the EV space. I know you guys have been doing work to kind of defend the previous administration's policies, the IRA, the EV tax credits, things like that. How has all that been going? Like if you could sum up, right now it's as of late June, how have those efforts been going?
There's so many descriptive words, right? Whiplash would be one. Murky, hard to define, right? What's the future look like? So maybe, I would start from one piece, which is just good framing for anybody listening to this. EVs are here to stay. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
The future of transportation is electric, and it's no longer a question of if, it's just a question of when. And so the federal policy stuff happening is really the when. During the last administration, they passed, as you've discussed, some really profound policies, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA. I sometimes call them Uncle Bill and Ira, but they basically established a really important set of investments in our transportation system to ensure that we could compete. So there's a global transition happening. And so sometimes it get lost in the details that the intention of this was really to make sure the U.S. can compete in the future of transportation, which is going to be electric. But it also is set up to create demand. So it creates incentives to encourage consumers in this transition, right? Second most expensive thing that people buy is a car. It's a big deal. You own it for a long time. So there's risk for people. And so the idea is that in this sort of scale, as we're going through this early adopter to mass adoption phase, you create government policies because we want to sort of move in that direction from industrial, sort of next stages of what's transportation look like. And so it's an industrial policy in addition to a lot of other things that kind of wrapped up in it. But now, new administration, and I think it actually is one of the problems. We need to do a better job of defining EVs, not as just a climate solution, whereas that's where they kind of started. That gets caught in debate, right? Climate, not climate. And do we need to solve that problem or not? Is it caused by humankind or not? And in reality, I think if we can position EVs and better understand and better define the broader benefits for why they're good for the grid, why they're a better technology, why this is just a car that gets you from point A, it just does it to point B, but it does it better. I think we can do more to make EVs a red, white, and blue issue and not a red or a blue issue.
And when you say we there, who are you referring to exactly? You think that's a government policy thing, elected officials, or automakers, or all of the above? Like who's kind of being deficient in everything you just said?
It's a good question. I was really talking about like sort of EV advocacy community, because I think, it started as a climate solution and that's great, but now we need to recognize that it's not just that. It is much more than that. And frankly, there's lots of reasons you can care and support transportation electrification, even if you don't care about climate. And so the point is we need to do a better job of making that message clear. So it isn't just about that as the reason.
I wanted to ask, why are we seeing such an incredible reversal of policies right now, especially for an administration that cares very much about energy independence, and jobs in America? We know that we were. It seemed like the IRA was sort of working towards these things before. So, but like, why is such a 180 handbrake turn shift that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ultimately just a philosophical difference of opinion, right, on what is the future of the country and where does energy come from and where is there a sort of point of focus. But I guess it comes back to the thing I was just arguing is we didn't do enough to make those other arguments. It really just still stuck into this green agenda. And, that is limiting, right? It really does create a division because that is something that the parties see differently. And if it was much more about an industrial policy and the future of the automotive sector and jobs and, that kind of stuff, I think we have a much better opportunity for it to be something that it's good for everyone's palate, right? It tastes great for everybody instead of it being something that's only good for a set of people.
Right. So that kind of focus on the environmental aspect led this to be more of a political football than maybe it needed to be.
It's not the only thing though. So this is also like we've hit peak oil demand. The oil industry wants to retain the status quo, of course, right? It makes sense. If I was in the oil industry, I'd probably want to do the same thing. And so I do think that there are other forces involved than just it's a, do you care about the environment or not kind of conversation, or do you believe in climate or not? I think it's also an economic issue where it's just it's a fight for what is the future of how we power transportation look like, and that's part of what we're also seeing play out.
Very, very quickly, even as a lot of these oil companies are getting into renewables and even EV charging themselves, there's still that resistance or outright fighting, correct?
Yeah, we always want to paint a broad brush, right? Like everybody is the same color, the same whatever, all on one side. And it's always much more complicated than that. So there's some, companies that have been much more invested in hedging, frankly, on both, right? So they're investing in EV charging and they're getting into that space and sort of a beyond oil kind of approach but not all. And so, it's something that not everybody's doing.
And I feel like, I mean, even covering this news, it's kind of like a whirlwind of kind of trying to keep track of all the different policies that are potentially changing, either changing, some are going away, some are maybe sticking around in a different form. Like, for the people, like, are there any of these policy shifts that you find particularly troubling, particularly important for people to recognize, like, hey, if this changes, this is really going to have a deep impact on the future of, like you said, the future of how cars are powered, how transportation is powered?
Yeah. There's a Princeton study that was done that you all might have seen. There's also IEA that did a recent report. There's several out there that are kind of like, what are the impacts of the dissolution or the recension of all of these IRA investments?
Yeah.
And it doesn't paint a great picture. The things that we care about, though, and care about a lot is, and IRA isn't just EVs. That's the other thing, right? Like, a bunch of these things are way, there's a lot of other things that are going to be affected. But we care about 30D, which is the vehicle tax credit. And it's often talked about as a consumer tax credit, but that kind of undermines what the real central goal of the policy is. It does create a demand side. It does encourage people to buy an EV. But the bigger thing it does is it basically pushes reshoring and friendshoring of the assembly. So that's half the credit is the assembly in the US. And then the other half the credit is the content. So making sure that the batteries and all the materials that go in those batteries aren't coming from what are defined as foreign entities of concern. So try to say that 3 times fast, but it's something defined by the State Department. And it's obvious countries that we just, might not share who our democratic values. And, we have concerns about their totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes, or they're known for market manipulation. And there are people like Russia, China, and some others. Another one is 30C. 30C is, and this is like, you need your chart at home to like pay attention to these. But 30C is the charging infrastructure tax credit. It's actually a retail, or not a retail, but a real estate based credit, basically. And it's designed to give people who install infrastructure a tax credit. And tax credits are interesting because sometimes we talk about like it's taking, tax money away from people and whatever. But the reality is what it's actually doing as a tax credit is it's just giving you as an American the opportunity to choose. You're purchasing this particular product and it's incentivized, and it's just your tax money is coming back to you because you're making that choice, right? But 30C is a really important one because it's both light duty and medium and heavy duty that's affected because the tax credit for the charging was set up to create an incentive for heavy duty vehicles. And then last one is just the 45W, which is a leasing credit and a commercial tax credit. Having all 3 of those go away is going to be a problem for the market.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, the Trump administration's signature big, beautiful bill that's working its way through Congress. Do any of these provisions have a snowball's chance in hell at surviving, and being in the big, beautiful bill in the end, being kept as policy?
I mean, I think, it's only going to take 3 votes in the Senate to sort of maybe change things. And so that's what we're trying to do. I would say it feels a little bit like Sisyphus, where it's like we're pushing the boulder up the hill and it's going to keep rolling back on us. And I'm not going to quote Greek mythology too much further, but we need a bit of a Horatio at the bridge moment. So we need 3 of these senators. That's the extent of my Greek mythology knowledge, by the way.
Just those 2 things. Yeah, that's enough.
That's it.
Though.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's our other podcast.
Sort of Damocles. I have one more, but
yeah.
It's going to take that effort, and then it's going to go back to some version of there's disagreement between the House version and the Senate version, some form of the reconciliation process. So I think we are unlikely to see success, but that doesn't mean we're not going to keep trying. And I think trying matters because it's this isn't over forever. It's just this moment in time where these things are going away, and we'll have lots of chances to rethink our policy decisions in the future, I think.
Yeah, and there's been this idea for months that, among people in this space that like, well, eventually some of these representatives, some of these senators will take a look at the amount of jobs being created in their districts, these battery factories going up, these EV factories going up, and they'll realize I can't vote against, I can't vote to gut these incentives. And that's not like it's, between the House bill coming out, now the Senate one, over the last couple of months, it's turned out that that is not really what's happening. How do you explain that? Like, how do you explain representatives kind of doing something that when you look at all the studies of the jobs this creates, it's kind of voting against the interests of the people they represent?
I think it's a good example of just the political discourse that exists in the country right now is one part. I think that we sometimes sort of view decision making through like sort of our singular lens. And the reality is there's lots of things that are a part of the package. That's why, as much as I want to try and the EV community might be trying to preserve the credits, there's a lot more going on than just EVs or transportation electrification. But I do think the reality is, we need to make sure those are very clear that this is not just some government largesse, but what this was unlocking is billions of dollars of private sector investments and commitments that were being made in communities that really need these jobs. And those jobs are not just, everyday Joe and Jane gets a job and that's great, but it's also going to have a ripple effect, right? It's the sandwich shop down the street. It's the, movie theater. It's all those things that ultimately are in those communities that are going to be affected. And so part of what we're going to do in the coming years as the Electrification Coalition is work with the state and local level to figure out ways that states can maybe fill the void if there is this vacuum created by federal policy for a little bit.
Besides just like the Democrats writ large, I suppose this is a very partisan divide. Who in Congress has been most receptive to these ideas? Or even the folks that are like, I've met like Republican politicians and interviewed them like, yeah, I'm not super down with the CV thing, but I don't want to lose the jobs in my district. Who is most receptive to saving this stuff at this point?
I think there's receptivity when you talk and when Tim brought up where are those jobs, right? Like there is receptivity. It just means, are they going to, lay themselves against the tracks in this, right? And that's the question. And so, we maybe haven't done enough to make that something that matters enough to them where they're willing to sort of put up the fight and to go against maybe where their party's at of getting this thing done. And so that's where we do need to build up more energy and support from both sides of the aisle, right? This is something where we just need to realize that it's like a reality. We've got to make the case better for everyone, why EVs are for everyone and why it really is this red, white, and blue issue and not just one side or the other.
What's your sense of how the automakers are factoring into this? Obviously there's organizations like yours that are really pushing hard for this. Where are the automakers? Are they at the table? Are they pushing hard for these EV credits to be saved, for charging credits to be saved? Or are they taking more of like a, if the regulations are going away, like we're just going to kind of go hands off here?
Yeah, a big one for them has been really prioritizing 45X, which is this, production tax credit, manufacturing credit. And so they've spent a lot of their time and energy on that. But, not all autos are equal in their investments in electrification, right? And so that shows up. And not all of them are ready to meet the requirements of the tax credit. So, right, if they're at a competitive disadvantage, maybe they don't want the Inflation Reduction Act to exist in its current sort of structure. And that might be where we look at coming back to the table. If this does all go away, can we reinvent some of these policies that are going to work for everybody in a different way? But yeah, so some are, fighting tooth and nail every single day on Capitol Hill to say this is why this is important and this is why it's critical in your district. And Patrick, you asked the question like who? There are letters out there that demonstrate both from the Senate side and the House side, members who have said, hey, this is really important and we need to take a scalpel to this, not a sledgehammer. And that's one of the things that we've really tried to focus on is maybe there are tweaks that we can make to the policies and how long they last and all of those kinds of things. But we don't have to throw everything out right now and create this cliff that the auto industry is frankly going to fall off of. Because some of them have made so much in the way of investments. It's like, this is pretty damaging, right? So I don't know if I got a little off track there, but it's like the idea is that the autos are in different places. And so some are really working hard on all the pieces. Some disagree on some of them because of what the opportunity is for that specific company.
One thing I wanted to come back around to is you mentioned, you're starting to think about doing more work at the state and local level, or at least shifting focus maybe from the federal, as the federal policy actually goes through and is signed into law, state and local stuff. What does that look like? What can states and cities do to kind of fill that gap? And, how much of that gap, I guess, can they fill, right?
Yeah. And it's not like it's suddenly like, aha, now we should go work at the state and local level. Like that's just been going on, right? But and in many ways, some of these policies exist because states proved those incentive policies really make a big difference. And they really do have an industrial impact, and a job impact, and drive the market forward. But some of those are things where we can work with utilities, because utilities have a super important role to play around building out the infrastructure. And so making sure utilities are enabled to invest in building out charging infrastructure. Some of it is maybe around localized tax credits. So Colorado has a tax credit. California has long-standing had a tax credit. There's also things like HVIP programs, what is that? But it's basically a heavy-duty vehicle incentive program. And the idea is that there's different ways to create incentive programs that can keep the market moving, not have these companies sort of fall off a cliff, and continue to prioritize electrification. There's already 14 states that have sort of said, hey, we're doing this and we're really going to focus. But I think we're going to see some other states that are thinking through ways to sort of build up their own efforts. And, maybe it's state competition and that's making sure the auto industry succeeds at the international level, until we can get some of these things wrestled back together at the federal level.
I wanted to ask, there's been a lot of doom and gloom in this space this year, but like we've also noticed kind of an uptick in good news, honestly, about like in a lot of different auto brands, like EV sales continuing to grow. Charging is getting way better in America.
Yeah.
You're seeing, bigger stations. They're going up more quickly. They're more reliable than ever. The technology there is getting like light years beyond what it was even a couple of years ago. I guess I'd ask, like, what's more good news that you've seen lately, besides just the constant drum of bad news to this space out of the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you read all the headlines, it would sound like this is the worst thing ever, and soon the electric car will be gone. But that's just not really true. Year over year sales are actually incredibly compelling still, and especially in particular markets. I think there's also a thing where there's a cul-de-sac effect, right? Like if your neighbor owns an EV, you're probably curious and you have an opportunity, and they're going to, ask anyone who owns an EV and they'll tell you the zillion reasons why it's the best thing that they've ever owned, because 8 to 9 out of 10 people are going to buy an EV as the only vehicle they ever buy again. There's a reason for that. And so those are good news. I do think the headlines, unfortunately, focus on the challenges, right? And like, that's a little bit of a function of just news. It's always bad stuff. The good news stories aren't that interesting, right? The bad stuff is always much more interesting and gets more clicks. And so the other thing I do think, and you brought it up, Patrick, but the cars are faster, charge faster. They go further. They're more efficient, right? They're getting cheaper every single day. And so it just makes sense that we've been in this early stage of the technology arc, and now we're hitting sort of manufacturing scale. And so, everything is going to become cheaper, better, faster. And the stories of what existed for EVs 5 years ago will be folklore and folktales and urban legend, because the future is going to look very different.
Awesome. Well said. I wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of like we focus a lot on, I think the news media in general maybe focuses a lot on consumer EVs, on like, who's buying Teslas, how many people are, how EV adoption is going for regular people. I know you guys also do a lot of work in the fleet and kind of medium and heavy duty electrification space. Like, give us an update. How is that going for like businesses who need, trucks and vans and stuff, and like, what are you guys doing there?
Yeah, I mean, all these things in some ways feel like this sort of story of great expectations, and it'll be clear that I didn't read the book. But the idea is, like, in some ways we did a bad job, and we, as meaning everybody, industry, policymakers, advocates, of sort of where we were and where we were going to get to. And like, that's part of the challenge. Is the expectations were that this was like a rocket ship that was going to blast off and everything was going to be electric tomorrow. And I think that just didn't quite account for the complexity of the auto market and the complexity of transportation. It's hard. This is not easy stuff.
Yeah. Everybody thought this would be easier than it ended up being. I mean, like top to bottom, policymakers, the automakers, certainly battery companies, like everyone. I honestly like looked at like what Tesla did to give that company its flowers. Like, well, they did it. How hard could it be? It turns out it's really freaking hard, right? Like, especially
Yeah,
if you're looking from a policy perspective.
absolutely. And it's disagreements about what that looks like, right? And there's lots of different things. But on the fleet side, I love talking about fleets because I think nobody understands total cost of ownership better than a fleet manager, right? And EVs win in almost every scenario in total cost of ownership. They have less maintenance, charging, and energy costs are, sort of flat versus, the cost of oil is up and down, up and down. It means gas is up and down and up and down. That's really hard for consumers to plan. It's really hard for businesses to plan. But with fleets, you kind of can get into this understanding of these total cost of ownership models and why that's the benefit. It has a big benefit. The other part is, I think sometimes we underthink, if that's the right word. We undervalue the benefit of fleet transition because these are like demonstration at scale, right? They normalize EVs. And so every time a city fleet transitions their vehicles, it means every single one of those drivers becomes the next advocate because they realize how awesome the vehicles are and how great they work, right? In some ways, we complicate this stuff too. It's like an EV is like this crazy computer and does all this stuff and V2G and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, it's just a car that works really well. It's quiet and fast, right? And you can just plug it in at home. Like, how cool is that? But fleets are a really good application because they create that normalization of EVs. And I think that's really important. They also can create a huge demand, right? Like, so if you get, and, Climate Mayors is a good example. They made a big commitment through cities across the country to go electric. And those create important demand signals. They also create part of the sort of formation of the used vehicle market, right? They go into these first application and then they become the used vehicles because they've been purchased in such volumes. And that's going to drive down costs and create more access. So fleets are just something we should be doing more on. And we have more work to do, but most of the fleets who have gone into this and worked on it have had incredible success and are going to continue to electrify more and more of their cars.
Mm-hmm. And then to bring it back around to kind of policy stuff, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about the California waiver and the kind of importance of, basically for the people who don't know, like you'll explain it better than I will, but California has had this ability to regulate its own vehicle emissions. They've had this, zero emission vehicle mandate where all vehicles have to be either plug-in hybrid or EV by 2035, all new vehicles sold. That has been tossed out by Congress in a rather controversial way. What's the significance of that policy specifically going away, obviously pending this legal battle?
Yeah, I mean, it's another example of like policy is complicated. And to get really into the wonkery, it's Section 177 under the Clean Air Act that basically gave California the authority to have stronger regulations than the federal government. And they could do that by saying the cars are a big part of their pollution source. And so if we want to protect the health of our, California residents, we can create stronger standards. And so they did that in the form of vehicle standards and said, we're going to require that any new vehicle, a certain percentage of vehicles over time are going to be zero or low emission. They didn't actually say they had to be EVs, but obviously EVs have become the sort of best pathway to meet that. A bunch of other states have joined that same authority. I think the challenge exists here is that not all states have gone through the same level of developing the incentives to match up with the regulatory requirements. And so that's why there's been some tension associated with. And so some states have done a much better job than others. And most would say California has done a really good job to match the carrots and sticks. But the Advanced Clean Cars, as it's called now, it basically is a regulatory policy. Why does that matter? It creates clarity in the market. It says, we know where this is headed. And so it makes it much easier for investments. It makes it much easier for the auto industry to say, I know what I need to do. And I actually think that one of the problems we have right now at the federal level is this sort of, that's why I said whiplash in the beginning. is it's this, sort of swinging pendulum of this regulatory requirements. I want to say one other thing, though. I think we need to be thoughtful about this mandates or, bans. I think that there's a political problem there. And like, I think in some ways that's created a little bit of this. And it's
It
not
doesn't
really what
work.
they
It
are.
doesn't click with people. It goes this like backlash where a lot of Americans kind of default to like, you can't tell me what to do. And
Yeah.
I get why that's unpopular, that phrasing, that thought, that
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah. And I think it's like, and it's not even really what the policy did. So I think in some ways, like, you just have to be more thoughtful about how we communicate it. At the end of the day, though, I think there's certainty that's important. And so California's authority is important. We'll see what happens in the courts, because what Congress did is going to cause a court battle. But I also think there's going to be work that states do and communities do that say, okay, maybe that isn't our pathway to sort of do this and creating carrots and sticks, but instead we're going to come up with some other methods to ensure that we, meet these goals around the future of transportation and that it's going electric.
I just want to do one more follow-up on the California stuff, and then I'll let you close it out, Patrick. Does that mean, you mentioned, Ben, that some states have better kind of better balanced the carrots and the sticks here? Like, does the auto industry have a point then when they say that like this advanced clean cars 2 is too ambitious, that it's hard, that it would be impossible to meet some of these annual goals in some states, let's say?
I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, there is an opportunity for states to think about what those incentive policies are. And that includes, have they done enough to help enable charging or charging distribution to happen? Because that's a critical thing. Have they done enough in the incentive side to support both education, but also creating demand in the market so that, we remove some of the risk around buying new technology. And that is a risk. Like, that is something where people are like, no, it's new, I don't know. And so that's part of the reason you create these incentive policies, is because it pushes people over the line, and they're like, oh, well, if it's a good deal, I'll take that risk. And so I think that's part of what I'm getting at. Now, I don't necessarily agree that things have been too aggressive. But I think that there's a case to be made that there's more opportunity for more incentives.
Yeah, this has been such a wonderful discussion. I guess in closing, I'm curious, like, what could supporters of EVs and pro-electrification policies and people worried about climate change, what can they do to stem the tide what they're seeing from the government? Like, what could people do to fight back? Because there's a lot of folks in this country who they're kind of frustrated by what they're seeing going on, and then they're kind of wondering what Congress is doing, and it often feels like nothing. So, like, what can anyone do right now about all this stuff?
I don't think you can argue Congress is doing nothing. They're just not doing what you want. But I would say I'm gonna something a little bit controversial. If you care about climate, don't lead with climate. That's not what's winning right now on transportation electrification. We need to make this much more about economic benefit, around the technology, around U.S. competition with China, who is way ahead of us, but we can catch up. Right? We can be a part of this ecosystem and a part of this future. And I think making it about jobs in our local communities is going to have a much better impact. And then, so that's one. That's like a lot of stuff, but one. The other one is, we just got to stop complicating this. We're EV nerds, and we're like, get into all this minutia, right? Manage charging and, time of use rates and blah, 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 V to G. And like, no, it's just a car. Like, it's a car that works.
Amen.
It does all that other stuff. So if you're really into it and you want to use it, my phone does so many things on a daily basis, or could do so many things I don't use it for, but it's cool that it does it. I don't need it to do that. I need it to do the basic functions. And so that's what these things do. And so I think we need to get back to that a little bit.
That's excellent and strongly agreed. Ben Prochazka from Electrification Coalition, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. And, if you're looking for more information about all the policies, who's supporting it, what cars are out there, if you're a fleet manager and you want to figure out how to buy vehicles, we have all kinds of great resources on our website, electrification.org, or driveevfleets.org. So a couple things that people can use as a resource. So thank you, Patrick and Tim, for having me on.
Thanks so much.